Recording lasted 47 seconds. That's all it took to end my daughter's case before it even began. The courtroom was a small one, wood-paneled, the kind you find in county courthouses across Tennessee that smell like old carpet and coffee from a pot nobody cleans. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution's table, my hands folded in my lap, watching my daughter's face as the bailiff pressed play on the recorder. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me once since the trial began. The voice on the recording was hers, unmistakably hers, that particular way she had of dropping her voice when she thought she was being clever, like she was narrating a movie she'd already seen. It has to look like his decision, not ours. If anyone asks, he wanted to move to Meadowbrook himself. He signed everything himself. And if he starts talking, if he tells someone, well, who's going to believe a man with early-stage dementia over his own family? Then my son-in-law's voice, what if the diagnosis doesn't stick? The neurologist said it was mild. And my daughter again, we get a second opinion. We find someone who will say what we need them to say. Dad's 71. People expect it. Nobody's going to fight us on this. The courtroom stayed quiet for a long moment after the recording ended. Judge Harwell looked down at her notes. The prosecutor, a compact woman named Ms. Okafor, who wore the same pearl earrings every day of the trial, let the silence do the work. I had been planning for this moment for 14 months. Let me go back to where it actually started, because the recording was the end of something, not the beginning. I spent 32 years as a licensed structural engineer, built a career working on bridges, mostly federal and state contracts across the Southeast. I retired at 66 with a full pension, a house in Knoxville I'd owned outright since 2009, and what I thought was a clear picture of my life ahead. Travel, woodworking, time with my granddaughter, who was 7 and called me Pop-Pop and thought I hung the moon. My daughter, I'll call her by her name, Renee, had always been complicated. Smart. Ambitious in the way that looks like drive until it becomes something harder to admire. She'd married her husband Thomas about 9 years before all this happened. Thomas sold commercial real estate and had a face that was permanently arranged to look like he was about to say something reasonable. I never trusted him, but I told myself that was a father-in-law's prejudice. So I kept it to myself. They had one daughter together, my granddaughter Lily. And for a while, things were fine. Holidays at my house. Summer weekends. Lily learning to fish off my back deck. Then my wife, Patricia, passed away in the spring of my 69th year. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. And I think that's when Renee and Thomas started doing the math. I noticed it gradually. The way you notice fog, not as a single moment, but as a slow accumulation. Thomas asking questions about the house at dinner. How much did I pay for it? Had I thought about downsizing? A friend of his had a mother who'd moved into an assisted living community in Farragut and loved it. Very active, very social. I'd probably thrive somewhere like that, Thomas said. Get out of this big empty house. I thanked him and changed the subject. 3 months later, Renee sat me down in my own living room and told me she was worried about me. She'd been reading about early cognitive decline. She'd noticed things. Had I forgotten about our lunch last month? Hadn't I left the stove on twice? I had forgotten the lunch. The stove incident was once, not twice. I told her so. She said she'd made an appointment with a neurologist just to establish a baseline, just to be safe. I went because I loved my daughter and didn't want to seem defensive. The neurologist, a pleasant man named Dr. Enfield, ran his standard battery and told me I had the cognitive profile of a man 10 years younger. Mild short-term recall variation, completely normal for my age. Nothing of clinical concern. Renee seemed disappointed in a way she tried to hide. Thomas said maybe they should get a second opinion. That was when something shifted in me. Not anger, not yet. More like a particular kind of alertness. The kind I used to feel on job sites when a load-bearing calculation didn't add up, and I needed to figure out why before I signed anything. I started paying attention differently. I noticed Thomas making calls in my backyard when he thought I was napping. I noticed Renee taking photographs of the house on her phone, not casually, but systematically, room by room. I noticed them exchanging looks when I mentioned my will. I also started doing some research of my own. I called my attorney, a man named Paul Whitfield, who'd handled my estate planning for 15 years and was the most unflappable person I'd ever met. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Arthur, I think you should come in." We met the following Tuesday. Paul had already pulled some information. In Tennessee, there was a legal mechanism called a conservatorship, similar to a guardianship, that family members could petition for if they believed a relative was unable to manage their own affairs. Once granted, the conservator assumed legal control over finances and living arrangements. The standard for granting one was lower than most people realized. A sympathetic doctor's report and a cooperative judge could do it. If your daughter and son-in-law are pursuing what I think they're pursuing, Paul said carefully, they would need a medical record supporting diminished capacity. They would need documentation that you're unable to manage your own affairs. And they would need to move before you have a chance to establish otherwise. I asked him what I should do. He told me the most important thing was to create an irrefutable paper trail of my competence. He referred me to a neuropsychologist, not Dr. Enfield, but a specialist, a woman named Dr. Miriam Cho at Vanderbilt, who did comprehensive cognitive assessments for exactly these kinds of disputes. I made an appointment. I also changed my primary physician to someone Renee didn't know and hadn't suggested. Then I called a private investigator named Dale Forsyth. Dale was retired law enforcement, 64 years old, and had the disposition of a man who found people genuinely interesting and was never surprised by anything they did. His rate was reasonable. I hired him for 3 months initially. I also had my house swept for listening devices. Clean, good. What I did have, Paul reminded me, was my own home. And in Tennessee, as long as I owned it and was legally competent, what happened inside it was my business. So I installed my own cameras. Nothing hidden in a sneaky way. I mounted them openly in the common areas, told Renee when she visited that I'd had a security system put in after a break-in 2 streets over. She accepted this without much reaction, which itself told me something. She and Thomas were either unbothered by the cameras or hadn't processed what they might record. They hadn't processed it. Over the following 8 months, Dale documented the following: Thomas meeting with an attorney who specialized in conservatorship filings, twice. Renee visiting the second neurologist, one who had been the subject of a medical board complaint 3 years prior for providing evaluations in litigation without sufficient clinical basis. The 2 of them touring Meadowbrook Gardens, a memory care facility in West Knoxville, on a Tuesday afternoon when they told me they were in Nashville for a work conference. And then there was the recording. I'd had a small audio device installed in the den, legally, in my own home, after I noticed that Renee and Thomas would sometimes step outside when their conversations got specific, but occasionally forgot to. The recording I described at the beginning of this story was made on a Thursday evening in November, while I was supposedly watching television in my bedroom. I was actually sitting very still on the other side of the wall, listening to my daughter plan how to have me declared incompetent and move me out of my own house by spring. Paul reviewed everything. He brought in a colleague who specialized in elder law litigation. We prepared for several contingencies. If they filed for conservatorship, we were ready to contest it immediately with Dr. Cho's assessment, my financial records, and the surveillance evidence. If they attempted to use the second neurologist's report, we had documentation of his professional history ready to submit. But Renee and Thomas made a mistake that accelerated everything. In February, about 2 weeks before they apparently planned to file, Thomas accessed my financial accounts online, not my brokerage accounts. Those had multi-factor authentication I'd added specifically with this in mind, but an older savings account, one I'd had since 1987, that I hadn't thought to flag. He used the login credentials Renee had photographed off a notepad years earlier, before any of this began. The kind of thing you leave sitting out because you trust the people in your home. He transferred $43,000 to a joint account he shared with Renee. I didn't call the bank in a panic. I called Paul. Good, Paul said. That was all. Just good. Because now there was a crime. Not just a plan, not just a scheme in progress, An actual, documented financial crime with a timestamp and a transfer record and IP address logs that placed the transaction squarely in Thomas's hands. Paul contacted the district attorney's office. A detective named Sergeant Briggs was assigned. I gave him everything: the recordings, Dale's surveillance reports, the financial records, the neurologist's background. Sergeant Briggs, who was maybe 40 and had the permanently tired eyes of someone who'd been lied to by too many people, looked through it all and said, "This is clean. This is really clean." The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning in March, both of them at their house while Lily was at school. I made sure of that part. Made sure Lily wouldn't be there. She was 7 years old. She didn't need to see her parents in handcuffs. I won't pretend the arrest gave me any satisfaction. I drove past their street on my way to Paul's office that morning and felt something I still don't have an exact word for. Not triumph, more like the sensation after you've been bracing against something heavy for a very long time and it's finally set down. The charges were elder financial exploitation, computer fraud, theft over $10,000, and conspiracy to commit conservatorship fraud, a charge that Paul's colleague, the elder law specialist, said he'd been waiting years to see actually prosecuted properly. Their attorney, a man named Mr. Hargrove, who wore expensive suits and spoke in the measured tones of someone billing by the quarter hour, tried several approaches. He argued that Thomas had implied permission to access the account, that the money was intended as a loan, that Renee had genuinely been concerned about my cognitive health, and the actions taken were from a place of love. Ms. Okafor's response was measured and thorough. The transfer was made without my knowledge while I was in the house. No loan agreement existed. No request had been made. And as for the concern about my health, she introduced Dr. Tation's, Cho's assessment into evidence along with a statement from my primary physician and the records from Dr. Enfield's original evaluation. Then she played the recording. "We find someone who will say what we need them to say. Dad's 71. People expect it. Nobody's going to fight us on this." Hargrove called me to the stand. I'd been expecting it. He was good, methodical, controlled, trying to walk me into saying something that would make me look vengeful. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you installed surveillance equipment in your home while your daughter was visiting regularly." "I installed a security system in my home," I said. "Yes." "You hired a private investigator to follow your daughter and son-in-law." "I hired someone to document what was happening around my property and assets." "Yes." "And you coordinated with law enforcement and an attorney for more than a year before any arrest was made." "I spent more than a year making sure I had the truth documented before I did anything with it." "Yes." He paused. "Mr. Calloway, isn't it possible your daughter genuinely worried about you? That her concern was real, even if her methods were flawed?" I looked at him steadily. "My daughter's concern," I said, "was documented on a recording in which she described finding a doctor willing to falsify a diagnosis. If that's what genuine concern looks like, I'd hate to see what indifference looks like." The jury took 2 days. I spent them at Paul's office mostly, going through paperwork that had nothing to do with the trial, just to have something to do with my hands. On the afternoon of the second day, we got the call. The courtroom was fuller than it had been during the trial itself. Word gets around in a mid-sized city. I took my seat next to Paul and watched Renee and Thomas be let in. Thomas had lost weight. Renee looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, which I imagined she hadn't. They sat down without looking at each other, which told me something about how the months in county had treated their marriage. The jury filed in. The forewoman, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, read from her paper without any preamble. Thomas guilty of elder financial exploitation, guilty of computer fraud, guilty of theft, guilty of conspiracy. Renee, guilty of elder financial exploitation, guilty of conspiracy. The courtroom exhaled. Someone behind me said something quietly that I didn't catch. Renee put her face in her hands. Thomas stared at the table. Judge Harwell set sentencing for 3 weeks out and denied bail pending the hearing, citing flight risk concerns given that Thomas had applied for a passport in January. I hadn't known about the passport. That detail landed somewhere uncomfortable. I want to say something honest about those 3 weeks, because I think people expect a story like this to have a clean, emotional through line, and mine didn't. I went home to my house, the house they'd been planning to take from me, and I sat in Patricia's chair in the living room for a long time. I thought about Renee at 12 years old, helping me rake leaves in the backyard. At 17, calling me from a payphone because she'd had a fight with a friend and didn't want to call her mother and worry her. At 23, walking across a stage in a cap and gown while I stood in an auditorium full of strangers and felt like the room was too small for how proud I was. I didn't box those memories up. I let myself sit with them because I think that's the only honest thing to do when you love someone who has done something unforgivable. You don't get to stop loving the person they used to be just because you can't forgive the person they became. But I also thought about Patricia, about what she would have said if she'd lived to see this. She had a particular way of going quiet when she was angry, not cold, just still. And I think about what her face would have looked like, sitting in that courtroom, hearing her daughter's voice on that recording. I thought about that, and I didn't feel conflicted anymore. The sentencing hearing was straightforward, in the way that things are straightforward when the evidence is overwhelming and the judge has clearly made up her mind. Hargrove made his arguments. First offense, no prior criminal history. Renee's sentence should reflect her lesser direct involvement in the financial crime. Ms. Okafor reminded the court that the conspiracy had been planned over a period of more than a year, that it targeted a vulnerable adult, legally, I qualified, by age, and that the psychiatric manipulation component, the attempt to manufacture a false medical diagnosis, represented a particular kind of cruelty that deserved to be reflected in the sentence. Judge Harwell agreed. Thomas received 7 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction, plus restitution of the $43,000 and an additional $80,000 in elder exploitation damages and legal fees. Renee received 4 years, with eligibility for supervised release after 18 months, contingent on completion of a financial ethics program. The difference in their sentences was because the financial transfer had been executed by Thomas alone. I know some people will feel that's not enough for Renee. I understand that. I'm not sure I disagree, but I also know that 4 years is not nothing, and that the conviction will follow her in ways that extend well past any release date. After the hearing, the bailiff allowed me a few minutes with Renee in a small room off the main corridor. Paul waited outside. This was my idea. I'd asked for it. She looked very young suddenly. That was the thing I wasn't prepared for, how much younger than her age she looked when she wasn't performing confidence. She sat across the table from me and didn't say anything for a while. "I don't understand," she finally said, "how you were so calm through all of it." "I wasn't calm," I said. "I was careful. There's a difference." She looked at the table. "I told myself we were going to take care of you, that you needed someone to make decisions." "I know," I said, "but you didn't ask me." She didn't answer that. "Here's what I want you to understand," I said. "I would have helped you. If you and Thomas were in financial trouble, and I know now that you were, the business wasn't doing what you told people it was doing, I would have helped you. You could have come to me. That's not the path you chose." She started crying then quietly with her hands flat on the table. I waited until she was done. "Take care of Lily," I said when she looked up. "Whatever arrangement gets made for the next few years, make sure Lily knows none of this is her fault. That's the one thing I'm asking you." She nodded. I stood up and knocked on the door for Paul. Lily came to stay with me for a stretch that summer while the custody arrangements were being sorted out. She was 8 by then, and she'd been told a version of events that was honest without being complete. Her parents had done something wrong with money and had to go away for a while. She accepted this with the particular gravity that children have when they're absorbing something they don't fully understand but know is serious. We fished off the back deck every evening that she'd let me. She caught a bluegill on her 3rd try and held it up like she'd won something, which she had. "Pop, pop," she said one evening, while we were waiting for the line to go taut. "Are you sad?" I thought about it honestly. "A little," I said, "but mostly I'm okay." "Because you won?" "Because things are the way they're supposed to be now," I said. "That's different from winning." She considered this with the seriousness of someone who was going to keep thinking about it for a while. Okay, she said, and then the line moved and we stopped talking about it. Paul called the following week to walk me through the restitution. The $43,000 had been returned from the joint account, which had been frozen at the time of the arrest. The additional $80,000 in damages would come from the sale of Thomas and Renee's assets, their car, some investment accounts, equity in their house, which they'd have to sell. The total recovery wouldn't cover the full amount, not immediately. The remainder would stand as a judgment against them for years. I thought about what to do with the recovered money for a long time. Eventually, I put $40,000 into an education trust for Lily, structured so she could access it at 18 for school. I gave $20,000 to a nonprofit in Knoxville that provides free legal representation to elderly adults facing guardianship and conservatorship actions. I'd never heard of them before all of this. I'd looked them up after talking to Paul's elder law colleague, who'd mentioned that most seniors in situations like mine didn't have a lawyer they trusted, didn't have money to hire a PI, didn't have 32 years of professional experience reading technical documents that had trained them to notice when something didn't add up. Most of them lost. The remaining money I kept because I'd earned it and because I needed new gutters. I'm 72 now. I still live in the same house. The back deck got a new coat of stain last fall, and I replaced the dockboard so Lily has somewhere solid to stand when she visits. I've been working on a commission piece, a writing desk, walnut, for a retired professor who found me through a local woodworking guild. It's the most satisfying work I've done in years. I play chess online most evenings against an opponent in Oregon who is slightly better than me and is teaching me without meaning to. I lose about 40% of the time, which I consider acceptable. I'm learning to see further ahead. I think about Renee sometimes. I think about the girl she was, and the choices she made and the distance between those two things, which is its own kind of loss that I carry alongside everything else. I don't know yet who she'll be when she comes out the other side of this. I don't know if she knows either. But I know who I am. A structural engineer knows this above everything else. The integrity of the whole depends on the integrity of each individual part. You cannot build something sound on a foundation of concealment. Eventually, the load exceeds the capacity, and the structure fails. I spent 32 years making sure things didn't fall. Turns out I still had one more job left in me. I keep coming back to the moment Renee said she'd been worried about me, not the version of it I heard on the recording, cold, tactical, calculated, but the earlier version. The one she delivered in my own living room with a look on her face that I almost believed. That's the part that stays with me. Not the betrayal itself, but how close I came to accepting it as love. There's something that happens when a person chooses to deceive someone who trusts them completely. It doesn't just damage the relationship, it damages the deceiver. I watched it happen in real time over 14 months. Watched Thomas and Renee make one small compromise after another, each one making the next one easier, until they were sitting in a car outside a memory care facility on a Tuesday afternoon, touring a place they intended to put me without my consent. Every choice they made pulled them further from the people they might have been. That's not punishment handed down from somewhere outside them. That's just the weight of what you carry when you trade your integrity for a shortcut. I think about what it actually took to survive what they planned. Not just legally, though that part required more preparation than most people will ever have to do for their own protection. I mean what it took inside. Because there were months, early on, when I second-guessed myself constantly, when I wondered if I was being paranoid, when I sat across from my daughter at dinner and thought, maybe this is grief, maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there, maybe I'm the problem, staying clear-headed through that, holding on to what I actually knew versus what I was being told to believe. That was the hardest work. Harder than filing the documents, harder than sitting in the witness chair. What kept me grounded was evidence, not emotion, not suspicion. Evidence. I'd spent 3 decades in a field where the difference between a bridge that stands and one that fails is whether you trust your calculations or your feelings. I brought that same discipline to the most personal crisis of my life, and it was the only thing that saved me. Clear thinking, carefully documented, patiently assembled, no shortcuts, no assumptions. And then there's what I did with what I had left afterward. I could have kept everything. I had legal right to every dollar recovered. Instead, I put money into a trust for Lily, because she is 8 years old and none of this is hers to carry. I gave to an organization that helps elderly people who don't have what I had, the professional background, the trusted attorney, the resources to fight back. Most people in my situation lose quietly. I didn't want my recovery to stop with me. I'm not telling this story because I came out ahead. I'm telling it because I want anyone who's watching, anyone who's sitting with a quiet fear that something is wrong, that someone they love is not who they claim to know that your instincts are worth trusting, that protecting yourself is not the same as giving up on someone, that it is possible to love a person, grieve who they were, and still refuse to let them harm you. Willie asked me once if I was sad. I told her a little but mostly okay. That was true. I'm building a desk in my workshop right now at Walnut. Clean grain. The kind of piece that takes patience to get right. I'm learning to see further ahead on the chessboard. I'm watching the sun come up over the mountains most mornings, which is something I didn't know I needed until I had it. That's what the other side of this looks like, quiet and earned and mine.